Hi everyone, welcome to my BSides Vancouver 2021 talk called Calling from Inside the House, or more technically put, how nation states use your domain to compromise your cloud infrastructure.
So a quick intro about myself. My name is Alex Parsons. I'm a principal consultant at CrowdStrike on the Cloud Incident Response team, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I've actually only been at CrowdStrike for about 1 month, and before that, I worked at Strasbourg, another cybersecurity consulting firm, for about 5.5 years. While I was working at Strasbourg, I gave a few BSides presentations for Vancouver and Orlando in Office 365 Incident Response. And before I joined Straws, I wrote one of the first papers on Windows 10 forensics while I was in college in Vermont. You can see a list of my certs if you care about those as well. And as always, opinions expressed are solely my own and do not reflect the views or opinions of my current employer, CrowdStrike. And just so you can put a face to the name, here's a picture of me, also a comparison of before and during the pandemic. That is a picture of my cat on a sweater, and that's a picture of my cat not on a sweater. And here's a dog that I recently got. So that's a little intro about me.
So let's get back to the topic at hand. Do you remember when around, let's say 2010, 2011, when cloud started to become a thing? And everyone kind of looked at it very skeptically because the fear was always, well, the cloud is going to compromise my domain. I think something that's interesting about some of the attacks and some aspects of the attack today is that, and what we're going to talk about in this presentation, is what happens when your domain is already compromised and they're using your domain to compromise the cloud, which is why this talk is called Calling from Inside the House. And this is a picture from the movie When a Stranger Calls. And I apologize if I've spoiled a 1979 movie, but I guess I have. So honing in a little bit more on what we're going to talk about on this talk. The focus for this is going to be on a compromise in an Azure AD or an Office 365 environment. All Office 365 environments have Azure AD, and identity is a core component of these types of attacks. So that's why we're going to focus on those things. Additionally, although I would love to go into the nation state attacks first, it is critically important to understand other types of threat actors at play, because the ways in which you detect those attacks are incredibly relevant with nation states. Something to think about over the past few years is that attackers are getting better and better. Threat actors are starting to find ways to bypass MFA. Ransomware attackers are now starting to get into the BEC game. And something that was just a theory when I was in college is that supply chain attacks are no longer just a theory. We actually see them happening now. A good example is a few years ago when we saw NotPetya, and within the past year, the Solorigate, I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but those types of attacks also involve supply chain attacks. So the goal of this is to kind of describe the different type of attacks by threat groups, detail how you detect those things, and then we'll talk about how do you prevent those things ahead of time. We're going to start with the basics, but as I said, the basics are fundamental to being able to detect nation-state attacks, because the basic detection methods still apply to everything else. Speaking of which, it would be remiss of me to not talk about the O365 MITRE attack framework, which is something that's been developed, I think, within the past 2 years. Essentially, what's great about the MITRE attack framework is they map out the techniques for all of the tactics listed here. So if you go to their website, you can actually dive into the different types of tactics that you might be familiar with from host-based analysis and apply them to Office 365, and it might help you kind of learn more about how cloud infrastructure actually works. I also have the Azure AD matrix in here as well, because that's also relevant. So let's talk about how Office 365 artifacts are laid out. There's two different types, historical and current. Historical artifacts are probably what you're used to interacting with a lot of cloud incidents. So think of your unified audit logs, your Azure AD sign-ins. With AWS, it might be your CloudTrail logs, things like that. Your current artifacts are exactly what it sounds like. How is your environment currently configured? And the question that I often get when I talk about the importance of both of these artifacts is, why do we care about current artifacts if I have the historical logs? If I see, for example, that an inbox rule was created a week ago and deleted 2 days later, why do I care about both? There's a lot of reasons, but a few of these is, well, what if you have persistence that you haven't detected within your roll-off period of your logs? And whenever you remediate, you are always going to have a little bit of doubt that you didn't perform a complete remediation. So for those reasons, I almost always like to collect current artifacts, even if it appears that you might have the full story from history.
So this slide, I'm not going to explain everything that's listed here. It's more of a reference slide. I've given other talks on how to analyze a lot of these types of logs. So, and that's a 45-minute talk on its own, but I just want to have this reference slide here. So as I start discussing these log types, you can reference them. In general, just know that these are the different types of historical logs on the left. And on the right, you can see a subset of current settings that we often pool that then become relevant during the investigation. Now here's some additional resources. As I mentioned in the last slide, my BSides Orlando talk is available to look at online. PwC also released a fantastic business email compromise guide. I would highly recommend checking that out. And in terms of automated tools, a Microsoft engineer created a community project called Hawk, and that is an excellent tool for getting started with pulling logs in an automated way. I do want to point out that ingest logs into your SIM if you can, but if you can't, you can pull them with Hawk. The PwC Office 365 extractor is also great for pulling unified audit logs. So those are, again, historical logs. The biggest thing here is definitely this Microsoft Cloud Incident Response Playbook, though. This is a new-ish playbook that released about a week or two ago, I think. And it is a fantastic playbook on how to go through some of these events. So I'd highly recommend checking out the incident response playbooks linked here.
Now that I've bored you with describing different artifact types and descriptions of those artifacts, I'd figure I would give you this fun fact, which is that the Washington State Ferry System is one of the most extensive ferry services in all of North America. It's actually number 2 when you look at the entire world. So hopefully that keeps you awake. All right, now that we're back on the topic, We'll describe the 3 different types of Office 365 incidents. They're probably the most common. The first is the basic. It's the wire fraud incident. So threat actor compromises a bunch of email accounts, eventually gets to your accounts receivable, and sends an email saying, hey, the CEO requests $5 million sent to this random address ASAP. Tricks somebody to send the money, and the money ends up going to the threat actor. Ransomware, it's a little more complicated with that. The ransomware attacks, rather than starting and almost residing entirely in Office 365 like the wire fraud attacks, ransomware attacks start with malware infections, and then either in parallel or after the fact end up compromising your Office 365 email environment. And the goal is to basically pressure you to pay more money. And then finally, there's the exfiltration and covert persistence incidents, we'll say, or in plain English, these are the nation state attacks. So these are the 3 different attack types. We'll get more into detail soon. So we'll start with the most common example of an Office 365 attack. You'll note that I have a difficulty rating here. This isn't a technical term. This is just how I tend to think about these types of attacks in my mind. So you'll see easy, medium ratings, and I have, it's just helpful for classification. Generally, with these types of attacks, they target organizations that don't have multi-factor authentication, and the initial attack techniques or initial access methods aren't terribly complicated. They either use a password leak that they find online from a company like, we'll say, Yahoo or Tumblr or whatever, one of those attacks, and take the passwords there and just attempt them on all the different types of Office 365 domains. Or the most common method is via phishing emails. So send an email, convince somebody to click on a link that goes to a website owned by you, and get their credentials. Persistence typically is really simple. It's just compromise more users, and if somebody finds out your user is compromised, then just get to anyone. And at the end of the day, you just want money. So here's an email where it's legitimately sent by Kent, or not legitimately, but it's sent by that account, and Charles trusts Kent, so naturally Charles will then just send the money, but in reality it's sent by the threat actor, and the money ends up going to the threat actor. So here's a diagram of what a wire fraud lifecycle might look like. It's pretty simple. It starts out with the threat actor sending a phishing email. User will click on the link, and although the page will look like this, which is a normal Microsoft login, it'll actually be owned by the threat actor. And when the user enters their credentials, it actually goes to the threat actor. The threat actor now owns those passwords, and they can log into the account. So once the threat actor has access to the account, they determine whether or not they have access to the right account. And you'll notice here there's a cycle icon here. And that's because threat actors will continue to compromise more accounts until they have access to the right ones, such as accounts receivable, which might have the ability to actually perform the wire fraud. Another core component of these phishing attacks is that they rely on trust from other users. So if they're getting into a company environment, they might email from a customer of the new victim. Additionally, inbox rules are a core component to hiding this activity. So on the right here, you have an example where the threat actor might delete all emails that have words that say you have been hacked, which would obviously, if the user were to legitimately receive that email, they would know that they've been hacked, right? Or if the phishing email itself or wire fraud has DocuSign in the name, then the threat actor would put that in the keyword list of things to hide. So once they have access to the account they need to perform the fraudulent wire transfer, they will then send an email requesting, as we saw in the last slide, for the money to be sent. They end up getting the money sent, and the threat actor will then use all of the compromised accounts they have to spread the phishing campaign to more users, or more likely to additional companies. So that's that life cycle. So here's a pretty fun example. Let's say Batman's email account is compromised, and Batman is sending an email over to a friendly neighborhood, Spider-Man, that asks Spider-Man to click on a link and log in with his credentials. So Spider-Man does it. Spider-Man's now compromised and is sending phishing emails now over to Iron Man and Thor. Now Iron Man has a lot of money, so the threat actor now uses Iron Man's account to ask for $10 billion for an Iron Man spinoff, and accounting at Stark Industries is ecstatic to hear from Iron Man, so of course they end up wiring the money over. Meanwhile, the threat actor looks into Thor's email account, and Thor doesn't really have much money because it's from a different universe and everything, and Attacker decides to just send out a Thorhammer raffle announcement, and a lot of people would love to be on a raffle for getting Thor's hammer. So the threat actor ends up compromising tons of credentials from the world, and that is a pretty simple but good example. The entire time, you also have forwarding from Thor's account going over totally not Joker at joker.com. Who knows how it gets there, because I've broken the whole universe between Marvel and DC. So that's a pretty simple example. So the next thing is, how do you detect that, right? And you'll notice, again, I break this down from historical and current settings. So some things that I mentioned are how the threat actor was creating inbox rules, and that carries through to here. These are the operation names that you want to look for within your unified audit logs. The other thing is that every single login, as well as the inbox rules themselves, they have IP addresses associated. So do GeoIP lookups for those IPs. See if they log in from a foreign country. I will say that more and more threat actors are using hosting providers based in the US. So don't just do one of those Splunk IP location lookups. You want to look at ISPs. You see something from Quadranet, that's probably bad, because Quadranet is the hosting provider for the majority of VPN services. Doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but it's likely that it's a consumer VPN service, and threat actors love consumer VPN services. Again, with the current settings, you want to look at your inbox rules and your forwarding settings. Remember, inbox rules can also forward. So definitely want to make sure that you don't have forwarding going on in your environment. Next, I kind of want to talk about the wire fraud attacks, the medium difficulty, as I want to say, or what we're actually starting to see today, which is that threat actors who have a little bit of skill are starting to bypass multi-factor authentication. And they do so via 3 methods. There might be more, but these are the 3 I've seen, which are, the first one is they'll just connect via legacy authentication, which is arguably the easiest. Basically, Microsoft has 2 types of authentication, modern and legacy authentication. If you don't, if your tenant is older than, I think it is August 2017, then you have legacy authentication enabled, and you need to opt into modern authentication. Essentially, if you still have legacy authentication enabled, a threat actor can just log in with POP3 or IMAP or another like legacy protocol like EWS or something, and they don't need two-factor authentication. They just get in a complete easy bypass. So definitely make sure you opt into that. But I want to move on to the other techniques. Token stealing is another method. So the idea is that the threat actor clicks on the link, goes to the attacker's website, but it's actually acting as a proxy for Microsoft's actual website. So the user still sees the MFA token process going through. So they see like, enter your number that you receive when you enter your MFA. And then the threat actor actually ends up stealing the token, the session, and then they have access for a period of time. And then for OAuth applications, that one I'll describe right now, which is that with OAuth, it's similar to what you see on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter. Facebook, most common when you want to take that BuzzFeed quiz and they say, hey, can I access everything on your profile? And you say, yeah, I want to see what Disney princess is the closest to me. So you say yes. Similarly, Office 365 has an OAuth protocol where you might get a prompt that says, hey, I want to access your email. No problem, right? And for a medium to advanced attacker level, they might rely on the user to actually click accept. And if you're lucky and you've compromised an admin, they check this box that says consent on behalf of your organization. And the next thing you know, they have access to everything in your environment. The threat actor does. So that's that. I also want to briefly talk about how these OAuth applications rely on the Microsoft Graph API. So everything you see here, it can interact with your calendar, your groups, your Microsoft Teams things. It can do so much, and it's incredibly powerful. So with great power comes great responsibility, or as we like to think of it, with great power comes a lot of evil. Again, I want to talk about why this is scary. Because OAuth applications give the threat actor the ability to keep having access even through password changes. And it doesn't matter if you have MFA enabled. And if you, let's say you know that they accessed your email and sent a bunch of emails, and you think you're good after you do a password reset and even like reauthorize all the MFA tokens, you're still not good. So it's something to keep on the radar. I haven't been seeing it widespread yet, but it's definitely going to happen, especially as more organizations adopt MFA. I also have this little diagram to kind of show you log in through here, and then rather than getting a prompt rather than the attacker stealing the password, they don't have to. I mean, they could if they want to, but they could just rely on you hitting this accept button. So how do you detect this? I have a list of operation names here that are often associated with OAuth. This is also going to be incredibly important as we talk about nation-state attacks because OAuth persistence methods are incredibly relevant with those. So this is just an example of a little bit of JSON that you're going to get if you collect unified audit logs. That's what UAL stands for. If you collect unified audit logs for the operation add app role assignment to service principal, you'll notice here that if you look closer, you can see the mail.read value is being granted because it says new value. And then you can see the fact that it says read mail in all mailboxes. So this event is actually granting access to all mailboxes in the entire environment through the application name, the mail analyze application. So that kind of went into detail, but a high level for medium detections, medium difficulty, again, everything I talked about in the easy detections, the logons, even the inbox rules, those are still relevant with these attacks. So don't forget about the basics. We're just building on them and we're adding more knowledge to it. So here's additional operation names. And again, you always want to look at your current artifacts because you want to be certain that you're actually remediating correctly. And you want to make sure that you don't have any current compromises in your environment. So definitely take a look at that, as well as your current admin privileges, because something I didn't mention is that sometimes they'll add users as especially the advanced threat actors. They'll add users, and maybe they'll give one admin privileges. Maybe they will give another just normal rights, just regular email, and they might just leave that dormant to wait to get back in, right? This is also a really important concept. For legacy authentication, you want to look at the BAF2 ROPC user agents. That is the user agent that you're going to see that relates to legacy authentication. It used to be called CBA and prod. These days, you'll see BAF2 ROPC. Another interesting thing is that for the attacks that bypass MFA, the token stealing events, as I'm calling it, I guess it might be more here to say session stealing, you want to check your Azure AD sign-in events rather than your unified audit logs, because there are scenarios, especially with that, where you won't actually see the first login in your unified audit logs, but it will be present in your Azure AD sign-ins, and the IP address will be from the threat actor themselves. The last one before we talk about nation state is this trend we're seeing where ransomware attacks are compromising the victims, and they're compromising their email accounts, and they're using that to pressure the victim. So why is this scary? Well, imagine if you're in the middle of an incident, you're trying to contain it, and the threat actor just blasts an email out to the press and to maybe even your competitors to say, oh, this whole ransomware attack occurred and the company is completely unprepared and their security is terrible, right? It's stuff that threat actors might say. It might not be true, it might be true, who knows? But it's incredibly damaging from a PR perspective. The other thing is, what if they could actually see email communications around ransom payment? What if you send an email to your insurance provider or to maybe you have a ransomware negotiator working with you where you say the high end I can afford is $80,000 or $8 million. And then the ransomware actor says they might actually use that against you, right? And then the other thing is that they can use it as an extortion method to say, hey, you have a bunch of social security numbers here, or there's some performance reviews, something like that. They can use that and say, in addition to the ransom, which is now recently stealing data and threatening to release that data, they can also add emails to that list of things they threaten to release. I think this is going to happen more and more, but we'll see. So overall, it's used to pressure the payment of the ransom. And I'm not going to go into detail with the detection because it's actually the same as wire fraud. The other thing to remember is that they sometimes will use something like Quackbot to steal credentials from the compromised systems, and sometimes they actually compromise personal emails, and it's not actually related to the corporate email. So just keep that in mind. So here's actually a really good example of a ransomware attack where their Office 365 environment was also compromised. Basically, there was a company that was compromised by the Lockbit ransomware group, and after they were frustrated, I just presumed that they weren't getting paid based on threat actors' tactics, but they then mass emailed a bunch of press and UK newspapers, and they basically tried to embarrass the victim in order to pressure them to pay the ransom. So just something to keep in mind, and you're going to see it more and more for sure. Hopefully not. Now that I talked about all this, here's a fun fact about Seattle again. Seattle currently has 15 light rail stations, and they will be adding 30 rail stations within the next 4 years, which is super exciting to me, living in Seattle. And then I also kind of grouped in everything from 2025 to 2041 and saying there's 42 stations coming there, but that is so far in the future. I don't even know if that number counts. Anyway, so let's get into nation state behaviors. All right, so let's talk about how nation states are different from normal attackers. To me, this is honestly really fascinating. So in a normal attack, you're going to get logins from foreign IP addresses. However, from a nation state attack, you're going to get logins from a corporate IP address, which obviously makes things incredibly difficult to detect because it's going to look normal. Because they're compromising the devices in your network, you're going to see all the activity coming from your network, right? With a normal attack, or we'll say a medium to advanced attacker, the attacker is going to create new OAuth applications, maybe even applications that they own that are cross-tenant, just to make their lives easier. However, with a nation state, they're going to be a lot stealthier, and they're going to modify the existing OAuth applications that you have in your environment. So again, the logins are coming from your IP addresses, and they're modifying your OAuth applications, which makes it so much harder to detect. Additionally, a medium to advanced attacker might also create a bunch of admin accounts to create persistence, which is pretty smart. But the items that a nation state might do are kind of next level in the fact that they might create an addition or like modify your federated domains so that they're setting up an ADFS server in their own environment, but connecting it to your cloud environment. Essentially, overall, it's just like next level persistence mechanisms. It's pretty impressive. So here's the scenario we're talking about. The threat actor has domain admin privileges. We'll say it's through a supply chain attack. We've seen that in Solorigate, or I know there's like 1,000 different names for that attack, but I won't try to name them all. But that's an example of a nation state through supply chain having access to your domain. Your domain controller syncs with Office 365 via ADFS. So in order to talk about that, let's talk about how that syncing is happening. And it's with Azure AD. And to talk about why this matters, here's this diagram. So the compromise start happens in your regular Active Directory on-premise. As we mentioned, the threat actor already has access to your domain. Compromise end, the goal of the threat actor is to gain access into your cloud infrastructure. So Azure AD is kind of the broker between that lets you centralize your identity management with your Active Directory, which is exactly how threat actors are going to then get into your cloud. This also isn't limited to just Office 365. Azure Active Directory can connect to AWS, it can connect to your GitHub instance, it could, it's anything your single sign-on connects to. So the advanced adversary lifecycle looks kind of like this. I start with the number 0 because it's I don't know, I thought I was being funny with 0 day, but maybe not. So the threat actor starts by pushing out the supply chain attack that I'm talking about. The company then, because everyone wants to install updates. If you have good security, you're keeping up to date with updates, right? So they push out the update, and when they push out the update, the threat actor now has, say, an account with domain admin privileges in your environment. They then use that account to pivot to Office 365 Cloud using a golden SAML attack. And we're going to talk a little bit about how a golden SAML attack works as well. But the key point is that it gets access into Office 365. So this is the pivot point to Office 365. They're in Office 365 and Azure AD. Again, all Office 365 environments have Azure AD accounts. And the threat actor can then use that, we'll say, global admin account in Office 365 to add OAuth applications, to add mail.read privileges to an existing OAuth application, which then creates the ability to the threat actor to then tie in via a new secret. And we're going to go through this step by step again, so if you're lost, that's fine. Something to point out is that this activity is all using internal IP addresses. So detecting this is really tough. And step 3, we'll say, is the threat actor then uses that new access that they have to the cloud now to use an OAuth application they built to search around your email environment, maybe even your SharePoint environment, and gain access to that email. Something I also mentioned here is that threat actor might also create additional admin accounts for persistence, a lot of things that we've seen in the easy and medium areas as well. So we'll talk about this golden SAML attack. The gist of it is that you have trust with your domain controller, and that domain controller trusts the Office 365 environment. They use this, all happens via ADFS, and essentially the threat actor, because they're domain admin and domain admins need to work with ADFS quite frequently, they have the ability to then basically abuse SAML to gain access to any user in Office 365. It doesn't matter if they have MFA enabled, it bypasses it. As I said before, it can work with AWS or anything that really has SSO or single sign-on integration with your Azure AD environment. And again, it's not like anyone can do this. You have to have domain admin privileges first. So the question is then, how do you detect these golden SAML attacks, right? And the good news is that Splunk has created an excellent blog post detailing the types of events that you want to look for to try and detect a golden SAML attack. The bad news is that unfortunately a lot of these event types aren't enabled by default. So if you're watching this presentation and you have influence on what events are enabled, you should take a look at this blog post here that will describe for you which events you actually want to enable. The next question is then, how do you detect a golden SAML attack within the Office 365 logs, right? So there's this kind of an anomaly of a number that's found within the user login events that was identified, I believe, by CISA. And when you find this 16457 event, it sometimes indicates that SAML forgery has occurred. I do want to point out that sometimes it'll create false positives, specifically around accounts that are guest accounts or external accounts like the cross-tenant logins. However, if you see it with logins with your tenant, it will potentially be related to a golden SAML attack. Another thing I want to mention, though, is that CISA has added a little bit of language that, to me, might indicate that this 16457 event might not actually be logged anymore. So it might only apply to 2020 events. Not 100% certain on that, but that's the interpretation I get from this quote. Feel free to correct me, though. Here's a chart that was created when I was working at Strauss Freeburg for a blog post that I helped out on. It essentially lays out this type of attack. So it starts with the threat actor adding a mail.read permission to a legitimate OAuth application that has always existed in your environment. Once the threat actor adds this mail.read application, they can then run some queries via the REST API to get messages from a user. There's also a lot of pretty powerful filtering capabilities. And once they run that query, you'll see here the result of that query, which is the emails themselves. So it's pretty simple. Add application access with mail.read with an existing application, and then they can do whatever they want. It's simple, but a lot of people don't look for this. Now that I've talked about what one of these attacks might look like in concept, let's talk about what it actually looks like from the front end. So what's helpful is that Strauss Freeburg created a really nice proof of concept application that uses the Microsoft Graph API. They have instructions on how to set it up here. Before you actually run the code that's in GitHub, you have to do a little bit of setup into your test environment within the Azure portal, and it's pretty simple. This is exactly what it looks like. Just create your application, then you add the right permissions. For me, I had to add the mail.read permission, and that's how you set it up. One thing I want to point out is that although in the proof of concept you create the application, in a nation-state attack, you might see that the threat actor will take an existing application that exists and add permissions to it. So that's step 2 in this process. So as I mentioned before with mailfetch, this is where it has all the permissions added. All you need to do is run your OAuth application that you created and get the data. And here's an example of a top secret document being discovered through the application. This is just a chart that I already went over, but it's here if you want to take a look again. But we went through all these steps. There are some additional persistence mechanisms that threat actors tend to make, which are creating additional OAuth applications, creating other admin users, and another item is adding the federation trusts. Federation trusts are so dangerous because if the attacker adds another, say they create an ADFS server and create federation trusts, next thing you know, they can start getting, I mean, they're essentially part of your domain then, and all of that identity stuff is syncing, and the ADFS server might not even be on your network, so you might not even be auditing it. The other thing is mailbox permission changes. We didn't talk about it too much, but there's a pretty common feature in Office 365 where you can give delegate access to other users, and threat actors might use their admin privileges to grant like one user access to a large amount of mailboxes and gain access. So how do we detect this? There's luckily a lot of tools here. I don't have enough time to go so crazy into detail with these. However, the main point is that There's a CrowdStrike tool. I would not be a true CrowdStrike employee if I didn't name this. However, it is legitimately a pretty nice tool. It does focus on current artifacts rather than historical. Then you also have CISA Sparrow and Mandiant as well. Sparrow and Mandiant's Azure AD Investigator, as it's called, they both focus on both current and historical artifacts. And then there's also the tools I kind of mentioned before, which is Hawk, which it's more helpful when you need to go deeper down the road and start pulling on the rope of what the threat actor actually did. And then I also mentioned the PwC O365 extractor, and the new tool I've seen lately is called the Azure AD Incident Response tool. It helps you get a deeper dive into your Azure AD environment. As I mentioned before, Sparrow and Mandiant both look for historical artifacts, and I actually looked at the operations they filter on. They're all within unified audit logs. I took that list and I combined it all, and this is what it looks like. So these are the type of events that it looks for. So you want to look for events that have an ID related to PowerShell. It's pretty common. And then there's also logins that have WinRM, PowerShell literally in the name. So if you add the -free text command or parameter onto your PowerShell command to search unified audit logs, you can search for free text with these keywords. Same with the SAML related thing, although as I mentioned, it might only apply to 2020 related events. There's a few on here that you absolutely want to alert on if you have a SIM. So all of these, honestly, all of the OAuth events as well. And mailbox permission changes are also pretty significant, although you might get some false positives. I think if there's one, if I had to pick one event, if you want to find nation state attacks, it would be, I'll use green for fun. It's the update application certificates and secrets management. Because if you have an application that already has global mail read, the threat actor doesn't need to do any of this. They don't need to add any more permissions or any more users. All they need to do is add a secret, copy that secret, and then they can get into your environment. And because that event is so important, I have a little case study here that kind of shows just how, what that looks like on the back end. So you might already have a legitimate secret here listed for regular application. And then the threat actor can just add a client secret. Hopefully they don't name it totally not a backdoor, but that would also make your life easier to find it. And that's it. They then create that secret, and then they have enough information to start doing badness. This is what it looks like on the back end with historical artifacts. The unified audit logs. You're going to see the display name and the password. Honestly, if you just alert on this every single time and just make sure that the user in question is actually creating a key or a certificate, that will help you a lot. Because OAuth applications are scary. They have a lot of power, so you want to pay close attention to them. With the automated tools, I also did a comparison between Sparrow and Mandiant. And what's interesting is they are largely both the same. However, Sparrow has a few more things that it searches for, although not by much. And Mandiant also focuses more so on the folder permissions that are changed. In terms of current artifacts, this is an example from CRT, or CrowdStrike's tool, that gives you a really good summary of what what can all these applications actually access? I think you'll find that there are a lot of applications you totally did not know about that have complete access to all of your email. Not always maliciously, but just from a hygiene perspective, you might want to cut that down. And to make my life easier, I highlighted things that are worth investigating. So these permission types application, it has the application, from my experience, it indicates that it is global rights. Take a look at the display name as well. Although, I mean, these aren't bad in particular, but I mean, you should be aware of what OAuth applications have such global access, right? So you should be able to look at your display names and see if it looks right to you. So I have here, definitely look at the permissions. I have highlighted here anything that's related to site reading, mail reading, file reading. So things to look into. And if it has all principals here, then that indicates that it can access, I believe it means that it can access it for any user. And what's here in purple is just if you want to take a look at which users actually grant individual access. So not every application has global access, but some actually are granted at an individual level. If you want to dive into that deeper, remember that pivot tables are your friend. So just by using that tab, I then created a nice little pivot table that showed me, okay, how many users are actually granting mail.send access, right? This isn't a great example because my test environment is small, but just remember that pivot tables exist. They will help you. So let's kind of go back to the basics. Remember that nation states still make mistakes. Don't forget your detection methods. Even for the easy ones, you still always want to look at the logins from foreign IP addresses or ISPs, because sometimes threat actors will actually log in through them. And sometimes, and when they start to get desperate, they get a little more reckless and they start to use tactics that might be caught via the easy detection methods. Same with medium. And one item I kind of want to talk about is how do you identify what emails are accessed, which is what every lawyer on the planet wants to know after they find out that you've been affected. You're going to need Office 365 E5 for all of the accounts if you really want to see the email access, because mail items accessed is an operation that shows which emails are accessed, and it's only there with E5. The good news is that OneDrive or SharePoint can probably be determined with E5. And again, plugging the blog post written by Aon/Strauss-Friedberg. It's right here if you want to take a look. It goes into more detail on how to actually look at it. This screenshot is pulled straight from the blog post. So let's say you know an application that was controlled by a threat actor. You then want to search the unified audit logs for that ID to see what was affected. And if you're lucky, you're going to get a mail items access operation back. And then you're going to get in the blue, it's a little cut off, so I apologize for that, but you'll see the message ID. And that internet message ID can then be mapped back to the subject name in either trace logs or in PST files. Also wanted to note that Sparrow actually has a really helpful thing where it will investigate one specific application and return all the mail items accessed events that interact with that application. So you can then cease it.
Now that I've given you a good idea on how terrifying these types of attacks can be, I imagine your next question is how do you prevent these things? So I'll list a few basic things you can do in your environment if you're not doing them already. And then in the next slide, I'll list more advanced things. So number one, you of course want to enable multi-factor authentication. And number 2 is to disable legacy authentication. If you don't disable legacy authentication, then enabling multi-factor authentication is almost pointless, because legacy authentication allows you to bypass multi-factor authentication. Hence why legacy authentication should be disabled. Additionally, you want to probably at a company level start disabling automatic external forwarding. And if you're wondering, well, how do I do that? You can click on the link down below. This is a blog post that I helped write for Aon when I was working there. It's a pretty great blog post with a lot of resources on how to actually prevent these things. You also, of course, want to enable unified audit logs if you haven't already. It's a one-click thing and it doesn't cost you anything. Other things you can do is you can configure mailbox audit logging. And although unified audit logs are restricted to 90 days, mailbox audit logs can go as far back as, I think, like 4 years or something like that for free. Unified audit logs you have to pay to get beyond 90 days. Additionally, you can require admin approval to add OAuth applications to your environment. So you have to have admin privileges to add an application. And then number 7, your users really are your most important tool to fighting phishing attacks. So security awareness training and just enabling the report message add-in is a really simple but helpful thing you can do just so you can use your users to help the fight against phishing. All right, so we've gone over the basics, but here are the harder things to do that are important. The first is perform security reviews on your third parties and vendors. As I mentioned before, the entire concept of these nation-state attacks live within supply chain attacks. So if you review your supply chain and your supply chain seems secure, then you're reducing the chance that a nation state will get to you through that supply chain, right? Additionally, you want to regularly review your environment. So for example, check out your OAuth applications every year or every half year, however regularly you want. Check your applications to make sure that all the applications that have access to mail are supposed to. On the inbox rule and forwarding setting front, make sure that all the users that are forwarding emails to an external email, maybe some are legitimate, but ensure that they actually are forwarding legitimately, right? And also make sure that if you have any protections in place, just make sure they still exist there, because threat actors like to change this. You also want to check your mailbox permissions, make sure nobody has access to 200 mailboxes. Again, forward your unified audit logs and your Azure AD sign-ins to your SIM like Splunk or Humio, which CrowdStrike recently acquired, or Elk, what have you, and use that SIM to alert on the types of events that I mentioned in the other slides. It's also in the next slide too. And finally, a new product you can type that you can purchase is a CSPM, such as Falcon Horizon. There's others. It will help you make sure your cloud hygiene is good. And here are the things that you can use your SIM to alert on that I was mentioning before. All right, well, that is the conclusion of my presentation. My Twitter handle is up here, so if you have any questions, feel free to message or at me. I'll also share the slides there. I also wanted to give a special shout out to both Carly and Partha. They are Strauss Freeburg employees who did a lot of the really pivotal research that this presentation is based on. So it would be incredibly rude of me to not mention their names. I also just want to give a big shout out to the entire consulting industry as a whole, because if you notice, I named just about every major consulting company under the sun in this presentation, and that's because a lot of the consulting companies did something that is a little uncommon, which is open source a lot of their work
and share their indicators of compromise in an effort to kind of step it up and respond to the Solorigate investigations. So shout out to the whole consulting industry. That's it. Have a nice day.